Hi, so today I want to discuss how women are discussed throughout the Trojan War, specifically in the Iliad. So my thesis for my paper is that by delving deeper into the non-traditional actions of female characters, we can discern what the Iliad states about women in a society overwhelmed by war. So I specifically want to focus on how war impacts women and changes and causes them to change their traditional roles in society. So these traditional gender roles are different for men and women. So men have roles of protection, fighting, and defending their country. They seek glory, fame, and power throughout all they do. Now, women's roles are the opposite. They protect love and support from the home. Um, they do not go out and fight as much, and women hold a lot less power than men, uh, politically and in the family. So women seek peace and prudence through all that they do. One thing that was necessary between the two genders was respect, because both men and women needed respect for each other to understand that both of their roles was necessary in society to keep them protected and society to be functioning properly. So one thing that I noticed while reading through the Iliad and studying the Greek text was that there's different descriptions for each gender, specifically in the epithets. So men's epithets typically revolve around tools and physical abilities. So the men are described with these qualities. For example, Epodiamoio, trainer of horses, Podas, Okus, swift-footed, specifically for Achilles. So these attributes describe how they act, while women's attributes typically describe what they look like, specifically focusing on their beauty or attractiveness. So a few examples include Leikolenos, white are specifically described for Hera, and Glaukopis, great-eyed, specifically for Athena. But these epithets of beauty and attractiveness do not only apply to immortal women, they also apply to mortal women, and they are both described very similarly. One thing that I was researching while I was looking into the topic of how women are described throughout the Iliad was this topic of hero, um, eros. So this word appears 30 times in the Iliad, specifically describing men. I found this info on Philologic. But one thing that was interesting to me was that women can also be essentially heroes by taking on masculine roles, so they can become heroines. And one quote that I found from Deborah Lyons was that these women are heroines, and these women were exceptional in wit and beauty, by definition smarter and more beautiful than ordinary women. So these women stood apart from ordinary women as standing up for themselves and for their country, and these women are those that I'm going to focus on in my paper. So, specifically, I'm going to be focusing on the women Helen, Andromache, Thetis, and Hecuba. So these women seek agency for themselves, resisting their traditional feminine qualities. So they resist their traditional roles in society and take on additional roles in a time of war. So first we're going to talk about Helen. Helen is one of the more famous women in the Iliad. So she runs away to elope with Paris, and she leaves behind her husband Menelaus and their family. And her actions of running away and marrying Paris incite the beginning of the Trojan War, which is a 10-year-long war between the Trojans and the Greeks. That the ending is discussed throughout the Iliad. So Helen's actions of eloping to Paris are non-traditional. And through her actions, she seeks adventure and pleasure purely for herself. She doesn't seem to consider what her actions will do for the country. But then in the Iliad book 6, she finally realizes the destruction that she has brought to both the Trojans and the Greeks, as many men have lost their lives fighting this battle, and she regrets leaving Greece. So the next woman I'm going to talk about is Andromache, and she's a woman very different than Helen. She does not. So Helen essentially resisted her traditional roles, and Andromache embraces her traditional roles in a way that makes her equal to the men around her. So one quote that I found that I really like describing her is that she's the juxtaposition, and then her character, describing her character is that she's the juxtaposition of the female life principle and matristic to the destructive aspect of the patriarchy. So Andromache is very family oriented, embracing her roles as a wife, mother, and a caretaker. And then in book 6, she and Hector have a discussion, and this is one of the last this conversation she'll ever have with him. And she attempts to convince Hector to stay home and avoid his traditional role as a soldier. And then in her conversation, she holds agency, power, honor, and dignity. These are attributes typically sought by men, and through this, she holds equality to men. So Hector is and then Hector follows the traditional roles of the Greek man. He lives and dies by the heroic code, meaning that he will fight for his country to the death. And in his case, he ends up dying. Andromache is terrified of him dying because he'll leave his wife widowed and his son fatherless, which is what ends up happening with him. So the next woman I'm going to talk about is Thetis. So she's the mother to Achilles, and throughout the Iliad, she continues to hold on to her strictly feminine attributes of compassion and motherhood, embracing the traditional roles of motherhood while holding agency for herself in this time of war. She holds on to her femininity, essentially her motherhood. And then the final woman we're going to talk about today is Hecuba. So Hecuba in book 6 takes on leadership roles where no men were present. So when all the men were off fighting, she takes on a role to lead the women and children to the temple as a means of protection. So this is found in lines 270 to 276 of book 6. And this display of leadership shows agency for herself and others. She displays a sense of independence through this leadership role and protection as she leads those she greatly cares about to a safe place and leads them in worship together. So in conclusion, we're going to circle back to my beginning question: how do women act in a time of war? So in the case of the Trojan War in the book of the Iliad, these women take on both masculine and feminine qualities. So they take on leadership and protection roles for those around them while also maintaining their caring and loving sides of being a woman. And specifically in times of need, they stepped up to take on masculine roles to protect their city and their families. And these are my references. Thank you.